Chapter 14. When I had entered the farmhouse through the back door, the moon had been full, and it was a perfect summer's night. When I left, I went with Letty Hempstock and her mother at the front door, and the moon was a thin, white smile, high in the cloudy sky, and the night was gusty, with sudden, undecided spring breezes coming first from one direction, then from another. Every now and again a gust of wind would contain a sprinkling of rain that never amounted to anything more than that. We walked through the manure-stinking farmyard and up the lane. Excuse me. We passed a bend in the road and we stopped. Although it was dark, I knew exactly where I was. This was where it had all begun. It was the corner where the opal miner had parked my family's white Minnie, the place where he had died all alone, with a face the color of pomegranate juice, aching for his lost money. And on the edge of the Hempstock land where the barriers between life and death were thin. I said, "I think we should wake up old Mrs. Hempstock." "It doesn't work like that," said Letty. "When she gets tired, she sleeps until she wakes up on her own. A few minutes or 100 years, there's no waking her. Might as well try and wake up an atom bomb." Jenny Hempstock planted herself in the middle of the lane, facing away from the farmhouse. "Right!" she shouted into the night. "Let's be having ya!" Nothing. A wet wind that gusted and was gone. Letty said, "Perhaps they've all gone home." "It'd be nice if they had," said Ginny. "All this palaver and nonsense." I felt guilty. It was. I knew it was my fault. If I had kept hold of Letty's hand, none of this would have happened. Ursula Monkton, the Hunger Birds, these things were undoubtedly my responsibility. Even what had happened now had, perhaps, no longer happened in the cold bath the previous night. I had a thought. "Can't you just snip it out? The thing in my heart that they want. Maybe you could snip it out like your granny snipped things last night." Letty squeezed my hand in the dark. "Maybe Gran could do that if she were here. I can't. I don't think Mum can either. It's really hard snipping things out of time. You have to make sure that the edges all line up, and even Gran doesn't get it right. And this would be harder than that. It's a real thing. I don't think even Gran could take it out of you without hurting your heart. You need your heart." Then she said, "They're coming." But I knew something was happening. I knew it before she said anything. For the second time I saw the ground begin to glow golden, and I watched the trees and the grass and hedgerows and the willow clumps and the last stray daffodils begin to shine with a burnished half-light. I looked around, half fearful, half with wonder, and I observed the light was brightest behind the house and over to the west where the pond was. I heard the beating of mighty wings and a series of low thumps, and I turned and saw them, the vultures of the void, the carrion kind, the Hunger Birds. They were not shadows any longer, not here, not in this place. They were all too real, and they landed in the darkness just behind the golden glow of the ground. They landed in the air and in the trees, and they shuffled forward as close as they could get to the golden ground of the Hempstocks' farm. They were huge. Each of them was much bigger than I was. I would have been hard-pressed to describe their faces, though. I could see them, look at them, take in every feature, for the moment I looked away they were gone. There was nothing in my mind where the Hunger Birds had been but tearing beaks and talons, or wriggling tentacles, or hairy, chitinous mandibles. I could not keep their true faces in my head. When I turned away, the only knowledge I retained was that they had been looking directly at me, and that they were ravenous. "Right, my proud beauties," said Jenny Hempstock loudly. Her hands were on the hips of her brown coat. "You can't stay here, you know that. Time to get a move on." And then she simply said, "Hop it!" They shifted, but they didn't move. The innumerable Hunger Birds had began to make a noise. I thought that they were whispering amongst themselves, and then it seemed to me that the noise they were making was an absurd, amused chuckle. I heard their voices, distinct but twining together so I couldn't tell which creature was speaking. "We are Hunger Birds. We have devoured palaces and worlds and kings and stars. We can stay wherever we wish to stay. We perform our function. We are necessary." And they laughed so loudly it sounded like a train approaching. I squeezed Letty's hand, and she squeezed mine. "Give us the boy," Jenny said. "You're wasting your time. You're wasting mine. Go home." "We were summoned here. We do not need to leave until we have done what we have come here for. We restore things to the way they are meant to be. Will you deprive us of our function?" "Of course I will," said Jenny. "You've had your dinner. Now you're just making a nuisance of yourselves. Be off with you, blinking varmints. I wouldn't give a tuppence a halfpenny for the lot of you. Go home." And she shook her hand in a flickering gesture. One of the creatures let a long, wailing scream of appetite and frustration. Letty's hold on my hand was firm. She said, "He's under our protection. He's on our land. And one step onto our land, and that's the end of you. So go away." The creature seemed to huddle closer. There was a silence in the Sussex night, and only the rustle of leaves in the wind, and only the call of a distant owl, only the sigh of a breeze as it passed. But in that silence I could hear the hunger birds conferring, weighing up their options, plotting their course. And in that silence I felt their eyes upon me. Something in a tree flapped its huge wings and cried out a shriek that mingled triumph and delight, an affirmative shout of hunger and joy. I felt something in my heart react to the scream, like the tiniest splinter of ice inside my chest. "We cannot cross the border, this is true. We cannot take the child from your land. This is also true. We cannot hurt your farm or your creatures." "That's right, you can't. So get along with you. Go home. Haven't you got a war to be getting back to?" "We cannot hurt your world, true. But we can hurt this one." One of the hunger birds reached a sharp beak into the ground with its feet, and it began to tear at it. Not as a creature that eats grass and earth, but as if it were eating a curtain or a piece of scenery with the world painted on it. Where it devoured the grass, nothing remained. A perfect nothing. Only a color that reminded me of gray, but a formless, pulsing gray, like the shifting static of our television screen when you dislodged the aerial cord and the picture had gone completely. This was the void. Not blackness, not nothingness. This was what lay beneath the thinly painted scrim of reality. And the hunger birds began to flap and to flock. And they landed on a huge oak tree, and they tore at it, and they wolfed it down, and in moments the tree was gone, along with everything that had been behind it. A fox slipped out of the hedgerow and slunk down the lane, its eyes a mask, and brush illuminated golden by the farmlight. Before it had made its way halfway across the road, it had been ripped from the world, and there was only the void behind it. Letty said, "What he said before. We have to wake Gran." "She won't like it," said Jenny. "Might as well try and wake—" "Doesn't matter. If we can't wake her up, they'll destroy the whole of this creation." Jenny said only, "I don't know how." A clump of hunger birds flew into the patch of night sky where the stars could be seen through the breaks in the clouds, and they tore at a kite-shaped constellation I could never have named, and they scratched and they rent and they gulped and they swallowed. In a handful of heartbeats where the constellation and the sky had been, there was now only a pulsing nothingness that hurt my eyes if I looked at it directly. I was a normal child, which is to say, I was selfish, and I was not entirely convinced of the existence of things that were not me. And I was certain, rock solid, unshakably certain, that I was the most important thing in creation. There was nothing that was important to me than I was. Even so, I understood what I was seeing. The hunger birds would, no, they were, ripping the world away, tearing it into nothing. Soon enough there would be no world. My mother, my father, my sister, my house, my school friends, my town, my grandparents, London, the Natural History Museum, France, television books, ancient Egypt. Because of me, all these things would be gone, and there would be nothing in their place. I didn't want to die. More than that, I didn't want to die as Ursula Monckton had died, beneath the rending talons and beaks of things that may not even have had legs or faces. I didn't want to die at all. Understand that. But I could not let everything be destroyed when I had it in my power to stop the destruction. I let go of Letty Hempstock's hand, and I ran as fast as I could, knowing that to hesitate, even to slow down, would be to change my mind, which would be the worst thing that I could do, which would be to save my life. How far did I run? Not far. I suppose as these things go. Letty Hempstock was shouting at me to stop, but still I ran, crossing the farmland where every blade of grass, every pebble on the lane, every willow tree and hazel-edged golden glow, and I ran toward the darkness beyond the Hempstock land, and I ran, and I hated myself for running, as I had hated myself the time I had jumped from the high board of the swimming pool. I knew there was no going back, but there was no way that this could end in anything but pain, and I knew that I was willing to exchange my life for the world. They took off into the air, the hunger birds, as I ran toward them, as pigeons will rise when you run at them. They wheeled and they circled, deep shadows in the dark. I stood there in the darkness, and I waited for them to descend. I waited for their beaks to tear my chest and for them to devour my heart. I stood there for perhaps 2 heartbeats, and it felt like forever. It happened. Something slammed into me from behind and knocked me down into the mud, into the side of the lane, face first. I saw bursts of light that were not there. The ground hit my stomach, and the wind was knocked out of me. A ghost memory rises. Here, a phantom memory. A shaky reflection in the pool of remembrance, and I know how it would have felt when the scavengers took my heart. How it felt as the hunger birds, all mouths, tore into my chest and snatched at my heart, still pumping, and devoured it to get at what was hidden inside. I know how that feels, as if it was truly a part of my life, of my death. And then the memory snips and rips neatly, and the voice said, "Idiot! Don't move! Just don't!" And the voice was Letty Hempstock's. And I could not have moved if I wanted to. She was on top of me, and she was heavier than I was, and she was pushing me down, face first, into the grass, in the wet earth, and I could see nothing. I felt them, though. I felt them crash into her. She was holding me down, making herself a barrier between me and the world. I heard Letty's voice wail in pain. I felt her shudder and twitch. They were ugly cries of triumph and hunger, and I could hear my own voice whimpering and sobbing so loud in my ears, and the voice said, "This is unacceptable!" It was a familiar voice, but still I couldn't place it or move to see who was talking. Letty was on top of me, still shaking, but as the voice spoke, she stopped moving. And then the voice continued, "On what authority do you harm my child?" A pause. Then, "She was between us and our lawful prey. You're scavengers, eaters of offal, of rubbish, of garlic. You're cleaners. Do you think that you can harm my family?" I knew who was talking. The voice sounded like Letty's gran, like old Mrs. Hemstock. Like her, I knew, and yet so unlike. If old Mrs. Hemstock had been an empress, she might have talked like that. Her voice more stilted and formal, and yet more musical than the old lady voice I knew. Something wet and warm was soaking my back. No. That was the first time I heard fear or doubt in the voice of one of the hunger birds. There are pacts and there are laws, and there are treaties, and you have violated all of them. Silence then, and it was louder than words could have been. They had nothing to say. I felt Letty's body being rolled off of mine, and I looked up to see Jenny Hempstock's sensible face. She sat on the ground on the edge of the road, and I buried my face in her bosom. She took me in one arm, and her daughter in the other. From the shadows of hunger birds spoke, with a voice that was not a voice, and it only said, "We are sorry for your loss." Sorry. The word was spat, not said. Jenny Hempstock swayed from side to side, crooning low and wordlessly to me and to her daughter, and her arms were around me, and I lifted my head and I looked back at the person speaking, my vision blurred by tears. I stared at her. It was old Mrs. Hempstock, I suppose, but it wasn't. It was Letty's gran in the same way that, she shone silver. Her hair was still long, still white, but now she stood tall and as straight as a teenager. My eyes had become too used to the darkness, and I couldn't look at her face to see if it was the face I was familiar with. It was too bright. Magnesium flare bright, fireworks night bright, midday sun reflecting off a silver coin bright. And I looked at her as long as I could bear to look, and then I turned my head, screwing my eyes tightly shut, unable to see anything but the pulsating after-image. The voice that was like old Mrs. Hempstock said, "Shall I bind you creatures in the heart of a dark star to feel your pain in a place where every fragment of a moment lasts 1,000 years? Shall I invoke the compacts of creation and have you all removed from the list of created things, so there never will be any hunger birds, and anything that wishes to traipse from world to world can do it with impunity?" I listened for a reply, but heard nothing. Only a whimper, a mule, pain, or frustration. "I am done with you. I will deal with you in my own time and in my own way, for now I must tend to the children." "Yes, lady. Thank you, lady." "Not so fast. Nobody's going anywhere before you put all those things back where they was. There's boxes missing from the sky, there's an oak tree gone and a fox. You put them all back the way they were." And then the silvery empress voice added, in a voice that was now also unmistakably old Mrs. Hemstock's, "Varmints." Somebody was humming a tune. I realized, as if from a long way away, that it was me. At the same moment that I remember what the tune was, girls and boys come out to play. The moon doth shine as bright as day, and leave your supper and leave your meat, and join your playfellows in the street. Come with a whoop, and come with a call, and come with a whole heart, or not at all. I held on to Jenny Hempstock. She smiled like a farm, and like a kitchen, like animals, and like food. She smelled very real, and the realness was what I needed at that moment. I reached out a hand tentatively and touched Letty's shoulder. She didn't move or respond. Jenny started speaking, then, but at first I didn't know if she was talking to herself or to Letty or to me. "They have overstepped their bounds," she said. "They could have hurt you, child, and it would have meant nothing. They could have hurt this world without anything being said. It's only a world, after all, and we're just sand grains in the desert of worlds. But Letty's a Hempstock, and she's outside if they're to be, and my little one, and they hurt her." I looked at Letty, and her head was flopped down and hiding her face, and her eyes were bright. "Is she going to be all right?" I asked. Jenny didn't respond, just hugged us both tighter in her bosom and rocked and crooned a wordless song. The farm and its land no longer glowed golden, and I couldn't feel anything in the shadows watched me, but no longer. "Don't you worry," said an old voice, now familiar once more. "Safe as houses, safer than most houses I've seen. They've gone." "They'll come back," I said. "They want my heart." "They're not coming back to this world again for all the tea and china," said old Mrs. Hempstock. "Not that they've got any use for tea or china. No more than a Karen crow does." Why had I thought her dressed in silver? She wore a much patched gray dressing gown over what had been a nightie, but a nightie of a kind that had not been fashionable for several hundred years. The old woman put a hand on her granddaughter's pale forehead and lifted her up, and then let it go. Letty's mother shook her head. "Silver," she said. I understood it then at last, and felt foolish for not understanding it sooner. The girl beside me, on her mother's lap, at her mother's breast, had given her life for mine. "You were meant to hurt me, not her," I said. "No reason they should have taken either of you," said old lady with a sniff. I felt guilt then, guilt beyond anything I had ever felt before. "We should get her to a hospital," I said hopefully. "We can call a doctor. Maybe they can make her better." Jenny shook her head. "Is she dead?" I asked. "Dead?" repeated the old woman in the dressing gown. She sounded offended. "Has it?" she said, grandly aspirating with an "ach," as if it were the only way to convey the gravity of her words to me. "As if an Hempstock would ever do anything so common." "She's hurt," said Jenny Hempstock, cuddling me close. "Hurt as badly as she can be hurt. She is so close to death as make no odds if we don't do something about it. And quickly." A final hug. "Off with you now." I clambered reluctantly from her lap, and I stood up. Jenny Hempstock got to her feet, her daughter's body limp in her arms. Letty lolled and was jogged like a rag doll with her mother's as she got up, and I stared at her, shocked beyond measure. And I said, "It was my fault. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry." Old Mrs. Hempstock said, "You meant well." But Jenny Hempstock said nothing at all. She walked down the lane toward the farm, and then she turned off behind the milking shed. I thought that Letty was too big to be carried, but Jenny carried her as if she weighed no more than a kitten, her head and upper body resting on Jenny's shoulder, like a sleeping infant being taken upstairs to bed. Jenny carried her down the path, and beside the hedge, and back until we reached the pond. There were no breezes back then, and the night was perfectly still. Our path was lit by moonlight and nothing more. The pond, when we got there, was just a pond. No golden glimmering light, no magical and full moon. It was black and dull, with the moon, the true moon, the quarter moon, reflected in it. I stopped at the edge of the pond, and old Mrs. Hempstock stopped beside me. But Jenny Hempstock kept walking. She staggered down into the pond until she was wading thigh deep, her coat and skirt floating in the water as she waded, breaking the reflected moon in a dozen of tiny moons that scattered and reformed around her. At the center of the pond there was a black water above her hips. She stopped. She took Letty from her shoulder, so the girl's body was supported at the head and at the knees by Jenny Hempstock's practical hands. Then slowly, so very slowly, she laid Letty down in the water. The girl's body floated on the surface of the pond. Jenny took a step back and then another, never looking away from her daughter. I heard a rushing noise, as if an enormous wind coming towards us. Letty's body shook. There was no breeze, but now there were white caps on the surface of the pond, and I saw waves, gentle, laughing waves at first, and then bigger waves that broke and slapped on the edge of the pond. One wave crested and crashed down close to me, splashing my clothes and face. I could taste the water's wetness on my lips, and it was salt. I whispered, "I'm sorry, Letty." I should have been able to see the other side of the pond. I'd seen it for a few moments before, but the crashing wave had taken it away, and I could see nothing beyond Letty's floating body but the vastness of a lonely ocean in the dark. The waves grew bigger. The water began to glow in the moonlight as if it had glowed when it was in a bucket, glowed a pale, perfect blue. The black shape on the surface of the water was the body of the girl who had saved my life. Bony fingers rested on my shoulder. "What are you apologizing for, boy?" "For killing her." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "She's not dead. You didn't kill her. Nor did the hunger birds, although they did their best to get to you through her. She's been given to her ocean. One day, in its own time, the ocean will give her back." I thought of a corpse and of skeletons with pearls for eyes. I thought of mermaids with tails that flicked when they moved, like my goldfish tails had flicked before my goldfish had stopped moving, to lie belly up like Letty on the top of the water. And I said, "Will she be the same?" The old woman guffawed as if I had said the funniest thing in the universe. "Nothing's ever the same," she said. "Be it a second later or 100 years, it's always churning and roiling, and people change as much as oceans." Jenny clambered out of the water, and she stood on the water's edge beside me. Her head bowed. The waves crashed and smacked and splashed and retreated, and there was a distant rumble that became louder and louder. From miles away, from hundreds and hundreds of miles away, came a thin white line etched in the glowing blue, and it grew as it approached. The great wave came, and the world rumbled, and I looked up as it reached us, and it was taller than trees, than houses, than mind or eyes could hold or heart could follow, and only when it reached Letty Hempstock's floating body did the enormous wave crash down. I expected to be soaked, or worse, to be swept away by an angry ocean, and I raised my arm to cover my face. There was no splash or breakers, no deafening crash, and when I lowered my arm I could see nothing but the still black water of the pond at night, and there was nothing on the surface of the pond but a smattering of lily pads and the thoughtful, incomplete reflection of the moon. Old Mrs. Hempstock was gone too. I had thought she was standing beside me, but only Jenny stood there next to me, staring down silently in the dark mirrors of a little pond. "Right," she said. "I'll take you home."